So, since the murder of George Floyd a couple of weeks ago now in Minnesota in the US, there's been an explosion of rage and protest pouring out onto the streets, first in Minnesota, then across the USA, and now we're also seeing similar protests across cities in other imperialist countries, not only Britain, but also France, Germany, and elsewhere. And it's sparking a big and very important conversation, a conversation that comes around periodically and dies down again, but which has been brought to a new height by the way that the pandemic, the health emergency, is really exacerbating the question of racism, because it is exacerbating all the inequalities in our society, in the capitalist, imperialist heartlands. The inequalities that were already growing rampantly since the 2008 crisis are now becoming exponentially wider with the latest 2020 economic crash, which has been made worse by the lockdown conditions, by the health inequalities, by the huge loss of jobs and dive into even deeper poverty for huge sections of the working class in the capitalist countries, the imperialist countries. And this rage is absolutely justified, the rage of the workers, but it's sparking a big conversation about what is racism, where does it come from, is it something that's inherent? Are white people just born to be prejudiced against black people? And how do we fix it? You know, there's a lot of debate about, is there any point to throwing a statue in the river? Do we need to spend our time on re-educating white people not to be racist, on policing language? Do we need to be working for a future where white people and black people and brown people and Chinese people are just kept separate from one another because inherently they're going to be prejudiced against one another? You know, if we want to find the right solution, it's really important that we identify the root cause of the problem. And what workers need to understand is that racism is built into the fabric of capitalist and in particular into imperialist society. Its police, its media, its judiciary, its prison system, its media, its politicians have to be racist, because racism is a vital tool for keeping the imperialist machine running. The imperialists need racism so they can justify what is otherwise unjustifiable, their wars abroad. They have to demonize those they are targeting in a racist way and reflect that racism amongst the population at home. They have to encourage racism amongst the workers in order for us to feel that the wars that they fight are acceptable. And they need populations at home who can be used as scapegoats for the problems of the system. The system creates inequality, the system creates unemployment and poverty. But somebody has to be blamed to stop the workers from understanding this. So the system needs scapegoats. And racism creates scapegoats and encourages workers to look at each other to find who to blame for their problems. That's how capitalism keeps a small capitalist class keeps itself in power, by dividing workers against one another. Now, I'm someone who, from a personal as well as a political perspective, has experienced the ills of racism. As a child from a mixed family growing up in a very white Thatcher's southeast of Britain, I experienced personally what racism was like. We had horrible slogans scrawled on the walls of our house, bricks thrown through our windows, regularly when I was a child, because my dad is a brown person. In my political life, I've experienced the frustration, the difficulty of uniting workers who are filled with suspicion and hostility towards one another, who are absolutely convinced by the prevailing media that the reason that their jobs are going and their services are being destroyed is that there's too many people coming from outside who are using and abusing those services. This is not the truth. It's what we're told, but we've been told it so much that many people have swallowed it. And equally, I grew up with the frustration of seeing the other side of that, which is being amongst Asian and black workers who are absolutely convinced that the answer to the racism they were experiencing in their everyday lives was to keep themselves separate and to agitate in their own communities for movements of black nationalism, separatism. The answer is to have black businesses, black areas that are kept for just black people where they can flourish and develop on their own, and maybe even to go back to Africa and, be with only black people. But fundamentally, these solutions leave the system of exploitation and imperialism intact, and therefore the system that generates the racism that people are pushing against remains in force. If we really want to get rid of racism, we are going to have to learn to overcome our differences, to recognise our common class interests in opposition to the system which is keeping us all poor, divided, and weak. There are two things we need to understand. Number one, that only unity and organisation is going to give us the power we need to win. And number two, that it's the system itself which is the problem, and no amount of tinkering with the system, with the laws, with re-educating people, with removing statues, none of these things, however angry we are, however justified we are in our rage, these ways of expressing our rage do nothing to fix the problem that has caused our rage. We need to find ways to channel our anger where the destruction is a creative and productive destruction and not a meaningless one. We must harness our rage and make it useful to humanity. And that means to getting rid of capitalism. And we have to recognise that our aim is not just to capture the capitalist state. We have to recognise this state is a state of a minority ruling class, which has been developed in order to keep the vast masses down. So if we want a world that's run in the interest of the majority, we're going to need a very different kind of state, a workers' state, not simply taking hold of the state that's been created by the capitalists for their interests, which is to keep a tiny minority of exploiters in power over the rest.